Well, I'm gonna kick it off. Welcome to the Fair in Medicine webinar, How Activism Impacts Transgender Healthcare, a pro-human discussion. I'm Dr. Carrie Mendoza, Director of Fair in Medicine and an emergency medicine physician. Fair in Medicine is a professional network of medical professionals within FAIR dedicated to advancing FAIR's principles of fairness, understanding, and our common humanity in healthcare. Transgender healthcare has become a polarizing topic, crowding out open and rigorous scientific debate, patient safety, and ethic concerns. I'd like to thank all our panelists for their generosity of time to share their work and perspectives on this important topic. Our host tonight and panelist is Zander Keig. He's an award-winning social worker, author, educator, and speaker. He's also a senior fellow and advisor here at FAIR. He is highly sought after as a speaker for corporate emotional wellness and personal growth workshops, and he certainly has helped us a lot here in FAIR to discuss this important topic. So I would like to pass it off to Zander to start the program.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mendoza. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. I'm so glad that you're here. I'm going to introduce the three panelists, and I'm going to do that alphabetically by first name. So I'm going to start with Aaron Kimberly. Aaron describes himself as a transsexual man who is biologically female. For the record, I also use that same kind of vocabulary to speak about myself. He works as a registered nurse specializing in mental health. And in January 2021, he launched the Gender Dysphoria Alliance to facilitate, I'm getting tongue-tied, to facilitate a more evidence-based, less ideological conversation about gender dysphoria. The GDA weekly podcast called Transparency takes a compassionate but heterodox deep dive into the topic of trans. Our next panelist is Corinna Cohn. Corinna is an author and an activist with the Gender Care Consumer Advocacy Network, which works to improve the standards of care in the gender care industry. Corinna published an op-ed in the Washington Post recently on what she wishes she had known before having sex reassignment surgery at age 19. I highly recommend everybody read that. It was a wonderful piece. I just reread it yesterday, as a matter of fact. Our third panelist is Stella O'Malley. Stella is a psychotherapist and an author. She has had 3 books published already. One is called Cotton Wool Kids, another is Fragile, and the third is Bulletproof Kids. And she's in the middle of writing a 4th book. Additionally, she wrote and presented the acclaimed Channel 4 documentary Trans Kids, It's Time to Talk. Stella is the founder and director of Gen Spect, an organization that presents a rational and informed approach to gender. And she's also the co-host of the podcast Gender, A Wider Lens. Welcome to the panel, Aaron, Corinna, and Stella.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So what I'd like to do is start with just a few foundational questions to get our dialogue going. And my hope is that we're going to land on some really meaty topics more organically, and then we'll be able to have a dialogue, because instead of, I'll sort of turn over the reins a little bit, because I want to join the panel. I want to participate in this conversation, since I am a member of the trans community and I'm a consumer of gender care services, and I'm a provider of gender care services as a social worker doing social care work. So I'm going to start, I'm going to go into alphabetical order again by first name. So I'm going to have Aaron answer, and then Corinna, and then Stella. I'd just like each of you to share with us, who are you beyond your bio? Just tell us a little bit more about who you are. I'm going to ask you also about your organization, so hold off on talking about that in this response.
So I guess that's me to start the AA. I'm always first. A little bit about me. I'll try to keep it relevant. My banjo playing probably isn't relevant, but I am a registered nurse. I've specialized in mental health right from the beginning of my career, which has been going on 15 years now. And I transitioned in the midst of nursing school. I was actually in probably I think it was first year nursing school when I started taking testosterone. And graduated from nursing school, launched into a career in the hospital-based psychiatry system initially, before I moved on to community-based mental health care. Working with youth who are trans-identified is a newer thing for me, and that's really the point that I became concerned about some of what I'm seeing in the healthcare system. I hadn't been aware of how much had changed in the system over the last 15 years since I went through the system, and the clinic that I was working with was, had a lot of trans youth coming to see us and wanting care, and so I did started to do a dive into how trans medicine is done, and I won't go into much more detail right now, but that's sort of the point at which I became concerned and why I'm here today.
Thanks, Aaron. Corinna.
My name is Corinna Cohn, and as you referenced my article in the Washington Post, I started sex reassignment or transition when I was 18 years old. I had had a previous relationship with my psychologist up to that point, so I was able to go a little bit faster than other people who were my age. So I started HRT when I was age 18 and had sex reassignment surgery at 19. And things were pretty good for a while. And although I was doing a pretty good job of leading my life and getting to know people and making friends, I would still have days where I had very deep depression about why I'm different. And as I became a little bit more mature, as I started to try to develop personally a little bit more, I came upon some ideas, and one of them was that it's okay to accept who you are and accept that the things that have happened to you in a way that you don't have to be ashamed about your choices. And when that happened, it unlocked a lot of ability for me to start dealing with my transition a lot more honestly, and it swept away a lot of my depression about it and anxiety about it. So one of the things that I do is try to write from that perspective and see if that works for other people who have transitioned, and try to accelerate them a little bit so that they don't have to spin their wheels as long as I did to figure that out.
Thank you, Corinna. Stella, how about tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Thank you. That was very touching, Corinna. I was born a woman. I was thinking all four of us here, I gather, I wonder, might have had gender distress as children. I certainly did, but I didn't transition. And I think I'm the one out of four who didn't transition. I suppose I come from a different background, maybe, or I don't know, like, it's sliding doors. We don't know why we made these decisions. But as a child, I had, for many, many years, gender issues, and ultimately, I left them behind for one reason or another. I think it's the $1 million question. Why does one person leave them behind, and why does one person not, in any condition? And I went on to live my life, and I became a psychotherapist in my 30s. And it's no wonder that I did, because I'm very, very absorbed in all things psychological. And I've since become a writer as well, and I write a lot about different issues. General mental health, always, a lot of emphasis on parenting and on mental health. And I am a mother, and I'm very glad I didn't transition. And I released an article about gender just because I've always had a very sharp eye on gender because of my own experience as a child. So in 2017, I was noticing things seemed unusual and increasingly unusual in gender world. So I wrote an article. I often write articles for the national media. I'm from Ireland. And from that, I did a film. And as a result, I've gone from being a very general mental health, who's always talking about parenting and adolescence and things like that, to more and more and more and more being rolled towards gender, because it's such an extraordinary issue of our time. And there feels like very mixed messages are coming out. Feels like there's a lot of silencing. I'm thrilled FAIR are running this. And as a result, I'm studying for a PhD in gender distress in children and adolescents. Pretty much I've become incredibly absorbed. From being a generalist all my life, it's just inevitably just I'm getting zoned into gender more and more every day.
Wow, thank you, Stella. And that's wonderful to hear. I look forward to reading the maybe the synopsis of that study. So all three of you have founded organizations, and Erin, you're in Canada, Corinna, you're in the United States, Stella, you're in Ireland, and so that's kind of interesting. We could talk a little bit about that, but the reason that I invited you all to be on this particular panel mostly is because of these organizations that you founded, because what I wanted to be able to do is I wanted to be able to share the message out to the broader community, trans, non-trans, healthcare providers, non-healthcare providers. I wanted them to see that there is no consensus within this thing called transgender health, and that we all have some part to play in it, and that we've all organized and started different organizations or affiliated with certain organizations like I have with FAIR, because we have a very particular work that we want to do, a particular message we want to get out. So I would love for you each, and let's start with Corinna this time, and then we'll go from Corinna to Stella back to Erin. I'd love for you to tell us each about this organization that you founded, and why. Why did you found the organizations that you founded?
Thank you, Zander. The Gender Care Consumer Advocacy Network was started in 2019 with myself and a couple of other individuals who were either in a state of detransition, medical detransition, and social detransition, or were in some state of transition like I was. And one of the things that we all had in common is that we knew from personal experience that the care that we received as patients was inadequate. It did not meet our expectations, and frequently either ourselves or people who we knew would be injured by some of the gender care that they were receiving. And because there are not very good standards of care in this field, it would be very difficult for anybody who was injured to gain any form of compensation. So one of the things that we wanted to do was band together and show that there are patients of gender medicine who are networking together and developing resources together. We also, we are nonpartisan. We didn't even want to get into politics, but one of the things that we did start to get drawn into a little bit is that there would be bills that were trying to outright ban medical provision to especially minors. And the mechanism of doing that was criminalizing the physicians who were trying to provide the care. And for a number of reasons, we believe that it's absolutely important for there to be more regulatory oversight, and that is absolutely a legitimate function of a legislature to require that oversight. But we saw that criminalization was putting a lot of pressure on families and making them feel like they were being villainized or victimized. So one of the things that we are doing now is trying to persuade lawmakers to find ways that provide a little bit more regulatory oversight, or provide money for more studies, so that the whole standard and level of care can be improved, and put the focus on evidence-based long-term health outcomes for all of the patients, rather than trying to lay blame or scare people from law. So we're trying to find the best outcomes for everybody. That's what we're up to.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Corinna. Thank you for that work that you're doing. Just to clarify, your organization is not supporting all-out bans on gender care for young people. Okay.
No, not at all.
I just want that to be clear for the hearing audience.
But we do know that right now the way that it's working, it's like the Wild West. So there are young people who are minors who are getting access to hormone replacement therapy and surgery with almost no therapeutic or mental health care or therapy beforehand. It's being provided on an informed consent basis, and we know that there's a lot of these young people now who are detransitioning. And when they detransition, they have permanent changes from cross-sex hormones and from surgery. And it's just a pity that they weren't able to get better support at the beginning of the funnel to make sure that those therapies were things that would actually be beneficial to them. So that's got to change.
Thank you, Corinna. Stella, why don't you tell us a little bit about GenSpect and why you started it?
Yeah, sure, I will. The reason I started GenSpect kind of goes before that. A year before, in 2020, I started the Gender Dysphoria Support Network. And that was started because I get so many emails from parents of children who are distressed. And these children generally have a long line of diagnosis, very often autism, ADHD, anxiety, eating disorders. And one of the diagnoses is gender, and gender trumps all other diagnoses. And so these parents, I wasn't getting one or two, I was way too many emails. There's no way I could have seen them. If I wanted to see these parents, I would have my waiting list booked for the next 40 years. It wasn't actually physically possible. And so I realized I needed to expand the situation, and I started support groups. And this was very much as a result of COVID. It was the first month of COVID, 2020. I often give a lot of talks and stuff. Suddenly I had a free calendar. So I started giving Zoom support meetings. And one meeting a week turned into 2 meetings, 3 meetings, 4 meetings, 5 meetings. And it was unbelievable how quickly it was expanding. And I realized that there was many other organizations just like the GDSN, the Gender Dysphoria Support Network. And it turns out there's 17 of them all around the world, and they all a lot of them are in America, but there's a lot of them around the world: Australia, the UK, France, Spain, and they're all saying the same thing, that there were secret organizations of parents who feel that they're very distressed children. These are not happy children. These are very, very vulnerable children with many other issues. So there are very much there's a type. They're socially awkward, they're cerebral, they're disconnected from their body, they've been through a lot of trauma, there's a lot of diagnosis, and suddenly gender has become the catch-all, one-size-fits-all solution for these young people. And I realized, oh my God, we've got way too many organizations, and it's all disparate and everybody's secret, and somebody needs to speak up and say something is happening. Thousands of parents from all these countries are all saying the same thing. And they're all talking about the same type of kid who we all saw in school, that geeky kind of intelligent, they're a very likable type, but they're a gullible and a vulnerable type. And so that's why I started GenSpect. It was like, can we bring some sort of rational approach to gender? Can we kind of come from an informed position? Can we take the voices of people who've transitioned and they're happy? Can we take the voices of people who detransitioned and are not, people who are lost in transition, perhaps like maybe Corinna, who are disenchanted with the transition process, and also parents who have children who are on what they feel like is a fast track to medical transition, and all other diagnoses are being ignored. And so a year later, after the GDSN kind of took off like a bang in March 2020, last summer in June, we started GenSpect, and it's got very big, very fast, because it seems to me there's such a need for people to try at the middle ground, rather than the polarized, just the middle ground of what's the most reasonable, what kind of serves the common good, what serves the most people in society, as opposed to any other kind of emphasis.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stella, and thank you for the work that you're doing. All right, Aaron.
Yeah, so in my introduction, I mentioned it was in the context of starting to learn about how the clinical work is done that I became concerned. And one of the things that concerned me most is how difficult it is to just ask questions or to have a different opinion and to just have a really honest conversation. And I think in clinical work, that's so important. When you're looking at evidence-based practice and what is best practice, I'm used to in other areas of mental health, being able to discuss freely our interpretations of that research and ask questions and have doubts and debate ideas. And so that was one of the first things I picked up on is just how that conversation and that debate isn't happening. And the other thing I noticed is any conversation about what is gender dysphoria, what is trans, wasn't happening. And so that was very puzzling to me. It's like, we're providing clinical services for a condition that we're not allowed to name and we're not allowed to understand in a deeper way. So that was very odd. And I just became so confused, and I started reading through a lot of the literature, trying to understand why practices has changed as much as it has. And it really wasn't clear to me. I didn't see strong evidence for this approach. And I didn't feel it was clear to me that this wasn't just the clinicians I was meeting, that this was very much a systemic thing that's happened around the world, and at least in the Western world, and how gender medicine is being done. And so it felt like me against an entire fortress where people had just accepted this is evidence-based, that this is how we do things, that this is expert consensus. And I was picking up on the fact that this wasn't really consensus, that it was very much, I felt there were people that had clinicians who had messaged me privately saying, we don't feel that we can say this publicly or within these clinical listservs, within the system of care, but we really agree with what you're saying. And so that concerned me. But it felt very much like me against this fortress. But I thought it confused me enough and concerned me enough that I wanted to bring other trans people together, because the other thing that was happening simultaneously with the clinical work that I was doing was some of my friends that I've had for many years who transitioned around the same time I did. I mean, I'm almost 50 now. And so my friends are around the same age and transitioned 15, 20 years ago. And they were starting to unpack what their transition had meant to them, including one who very much regrets transition 20 years later, and now that he understands what had motivated his transition. So hearing those stories and hearing that we all transitioned for different reasons, because I had just assumed that my childhood experience of gender dysphoria was diagnosable, and that's what everyone else was diagnosed with, and that's why everyone else was transitioning. And there wasn't a lot of conversation about that in the trans community, but these close friends of mine were starting to unpack what their transition meant and didn't have the same experience that I had, and didn't have the same motivations for transitioning, and didn't have the same outcomes. So the reason I founded Gender Dysphoria Alliance, it originally just started as like a lightning rod in Canada to try to attract like-minded trans people to have the conversations, to support one another, to have those conversations, knowing that in this political environment, there can be backlash from asking the wrong kinds of questions or raising the wrong kinds of concerns. But I very quickly learned that there are a lot of trans people who share my concerns, don't necessarily share every single one of my opinions, and that's fine, but share certain concerns and are at least willing to have difficult and deeper conversations. So the organization, though started just in Canada, it's since expanded international. We do have quite a few people working behind the scenes that are networked with us. And our primary objective really is to give a voice to the trans people or detransitioners or people who had some experience of gender dysphoria who didn't necessarily transition, to give people a voice and to facilitate conversations that are just personal and raw and truthful without that lens of the activism.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Aaron. Thank you for the work that you're doing. I'm going to ask one final question as far as the formatted kinds of questions, because my hope is, again, that we're going to become a bit more organic about the dialogue. But what I really want to know is how have others, broadly speaking, how have others responded to your efforts, not only your organizational efforts, but some of the some of the efforts that have come out. Like for all three of you are on podcasts. You have podcasts. That wasn't mentioned in Corinna's bio, but you do have a podcast. And so, so people are responding in comment sections to podcasts, and if you're putting them up on YouTube, they're commenting, and people are getting in touch with you. I'm sure you're dealing with people on social media. So I'd love to know, if you want to just share with us some of the, some of the positive and also some of the, more concerning responses that you've gotten. And of those concerned responses, I'd love to know, like, where are they coming from? Are they coming from the trans community, from the non-trans community, the medical community? I'm just curious about that. Why don't we start this time with Stella, and then we'll go from Stella to Aaron to Corinna.
It's interesting. When I first got into gender, maybe 2018, I felt I could name everybody who agreed with me in the world, because it was such a small circle. And now it's a much bigger circle, and it feels like it's not a community anymore, which is a good thing, because it feels like it's a lot of different people are responding in different walks of life, which is lovely. And it's lovely to see, just random things like social workers getting involved, and then doctors getting involved, and teachers getting involved. So it does feel like people are waking up to the fact that, that there has been a lot of presumption around gender healthcare that doesn't really have any weight or substance behind it. So yeah, there has been an awful lot of positive responses. I would be a liar to say that there hasn't been negative. There certainly has. The negative, it's actually very unnerving when you're attacked, because you feel like it feels almost like public shaming quite quickly, and it also feels like you want to talk to them. You want to say, well, no, it's okay. Let's just discuss it, and you'll understand. And you try to, at the beginning, when you're young and naive, a few years ago, I tried to engage genuinely, just thinking, oh no, it'll be okay, because I'll explain where I'm coming from. And then like crazy responses that would be just like, oh my God, I'm actually talking to somebody really mad. And you'd shriek back with a kind of, oh my God. And I remember somebody famous saying, like, we lost a lot with the internet, insofar as you used to be able to see the crazies with the green ink and the kind of the scrawling letters. But now with spell check, and they look very, very, very sane, and they come at you in a quite a reasonable manner. And then within 2 messages, they're literally spewing abuse at you. No, not always, but very often. And it's very often anonymous accounts. And it's actually a very unnerving, weird experience that I've never had before in my life.
Well, I'm sorry that's happening to you. I would imagine you're not the only one on the panel, but still I could imagine to some degree that could feel frightening also, because if it's anonymous, you have no idea. Is it your neighbor? Is it somebody across the pond? Is it like, who are these people? So that's really unfortunate.
It's frightening, and it's strange. It's a very strange experience.
Yeah, it sounds like it. How about you, Aaron?
Similar experience to what Stella described, but I would say that the response has been majority positive, which I'm really happy about. So, I mean, we get people messaging us, sending us emails, or commenting on our posts and podcasts. We seem to be drawing people into what I'm calling the rational middle, of people that are reasonable and caring people who just don't understand or have concerns and just want to be able to talk about it and air those concerns and come up with some answers. And so we have people commenting, messaging us saying, I've been really unhappy with my transition, and you've given me the courage to detransition. We've had trans people say, at first I hated what you were saying, but once I started to really listen, that you've changed my mind about the politics and how I understand myself. So that's encouraging. And we've had people message us saying, I've been so disillusioned and just had written off the whole LGBT community because of how strange the politics have become, and you've brought me back, to empathy and back into these conversations, and seeing that you're not a monolith, and you're not you're not all pushing this same singular agenda. So it's been a real mix of comments and feedback, but I would say the majority has been positive. But there have been periods of fairly intense criticism, like what Stella said, sort of the Twitter mobs and that online backlash. But all in all, I would say that the feedback has been positive and supportive.
That's fantastic to hear. Yeah, and unfortunate, you know, that you have had to deal with some of the less rational elements. Corinna, how about you? What's been some of the response?
Well, I'm sorry for Stella and Aaron, because I've had just uniformly fantastic response. I even had one woman who made a series of fan videos about me. So I really appreciate that she was so interested in what I had to say. I try to.
Are you being sarcastic?
Oh, I didn't get it. You are. I'm so stupid.
No, I'm sorry. Trying to put a positive spin on it. That's all. A lot of my communication style is that I just try to be very vulnerable and raw, and just like speak without having a lot of defensiveness. And when people are angry at me and they tell me so, that for me is actually something of a blessing, because if I can get them to start having a conversation and can get them to talk about about that issue, what is important to them. It has happened so many times that has led into a conversation where people actually do open up. They do have concerns. A lot of people are worried that if they have trans healthcare right now, that they're scared the Republicans will come and take it away. They're scared that they are getting care and they actually don't know if they're getting the right care, and they don't know what to do. I've talked to a number of parents who really love their kids. They don't want to lose their kids, but they don't even know what the right thing to say to them is if their child starts to transition. And so they're looking for somebody who they can just trust to say what's on their minds. So for me, although I have had a number of people who have offered some negative feedback, anytime anybody will respond and listen, that is, for me, 100 times better than somebody who just writes me off and ignores me. So I do want engagement. I do want people to ask questions. I do want people to tell me what's on their mind. I want to listen to people. So yeah, there's been a few negative things, but I'm not going to let that stop me from trying to form relationships with people who will have a conversation with me.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I actually surprised myself that I picked up on the sarcasm, because I typically don't. It usually just goes right past me, but something told me, wait a minute, that can't be right. And I had to double check. You know, it's I'm not a person who founded an organization, but I have affiliated myself with FAIR. And as a result, it has gotten me into some hot water as far as, you know, people responding to me in a pretty negative way. And it's cost me to a certain degree. I was recently disinvited to be a keynote speaker at a conference. There's another organization in the state of Arizona that put out a very large statement, you know, or a long statement denouncing they didn't name me directly, but they named the webinar that I was on. So, you know, we know who they're talking about. Those of us on the webinar denounced our statements as harmful. And, you know, so it's, I have been on the receiving end, and I was actually affiliated for about 4 days, I think, with the Gender Dysphoria Alliance. And that got me kicked off of a national committee, a Transgender Organizations National Advocacy Committee, as the chair of that organization. So I have paid, so to speak. But for anybody who's listening right now that is at all familiar with FAIR, and even if you're not familiar with FAIR, you may be familiar with one of our founding advisory board members, which his name is Daryl Davis. And Daryl Davis is an American Black man who has spent countless, probably thousands of hours in his lifetime sitting next to, across from members of the Ku Klux Klan, and neo-Nazi white supremacy organizations and asked them the question, why do you hate me? And listened to their answer. He let them talk, and then he would engage in dialogue with them. And over the course of months, years, in some cases, they began to denounce their affiliation with these organizations. And he has now collected over 200 sets of robes and hoods from these former Klans members. So I'm all for what Corinna was just advocating for, which is listening. But it is not an easy thing to do. Right? It's not an easy thing to do. And we're asking people to do that right now, right? Because there may be people listening to us right now and they don't understand. They don't understand why we're coming from this perspective. They don't understand. They think we want to block and ban. And I've been called transphobic. I don't know about you, Aaron and Corinna and Stella. Right? So many things came up when you were answering the questions, and I jotted down a few things. I hope you kind of jotted down a few things because, you know, I'm very much interested in this idea of inadequate gender care services. Quite honestly, I've been on testosterone for 17 years, and I was able to get a prescription in one visit with a medical doctor, and I got top surgery without having to get a letter. So I was able to take advantage of those systems. I was 39 years old. I think that's a little different. There are long-term health outcomes that we don't really ever talk about. So maybe some of us are dealing with some of those things right now. I love the idea of talking about the lack of consensus and the fact that we're not a monolith. I actually wrote a fair Substack article about we're not a monolith. Exactly. And also this idea of the diversity of reasons for why we transitioned, right? I mean, we don't have a lot of time. We've got about 15 to 20 minutes left, but what would you like to, what do you think would be the most important sort of final topic that you really want the people that are listening to hear about? And we can each have a different one, but again, just keeping in mind we've got about 20 minutes for our portion.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about the different reasons that people transition. You know, because like I said earlier, I always just assumed that everyone that was trans had the same experience that I had, and so I did have early childhood gender dysphoria, and just assume that that's what was diagnosed when I went through an assessment process, and that everyone that's trans experienced the same thing. But probably even just on this panel, there are probably different reasons for why people transition. So I wondered if that could maybe be a place to start.
Yeah, do you want to give just a brief, you know, background about that for yourself? For myself,
yeah. So I had what I now understand as early childhood onset gender dysphoria, which is highly correlated, though not exclusively, but highly correlated with homosexuality. And so what I've pieced together, because when I did start reading through the literature, I came across Dr. Blanchard's research from the 80s and 90s in particular. And that, I don't think that everyone that transitioned falls into that typology, but I definitely, the homosexual subtype, so he had two subtypes, the homosexual subtype of gender dysphoria, which tends to be the early childhood onset type, and the other type being what he called autogynephilia, which is, it's what we might have, 20 years ago called transvestism. It's a type of fetish. But it was the description of the homosexual subtype that really resonated with me. And I understand my gender dysphoria now to be related to my sexual orientation and being gay. And I think a lot of it's something that I'm hoping to get the gay and lesbian community to open up about more, because when you talk to a lot of adult gay and lesbian people, they have a childhood experience of some degree of cross-sex identification or gender non-conforming behavior. And I didn't know that at the time that I transitioned. I definitely knew some butch lesbians in my circles, my social circle, that had described having gender dysphoria. So I did have an intuitive sense that it was somehow related to homosexuality, but at some point I became sort of ideologically captured with this idea that if you have that experience, it meant you are a trans person as a separate type of personhood. And I don't believe that's true anymore. I think my experience was very much related to being a butch lesbian.
Although you were a child, so it's like as if you would have developed into, well, you did probably, because you just started the transition 15 years ago. So
so for me, when you learn about the desistance rates that 60 to 90% of kids with gender dysphoria do desist by the time they're adults, but I was of that minority percentage that it hadn't resolved well into my mid-30s.
All right, thank you for sharing that, Aaron. How about you, Corinna? What would you say is, the reason, if you had to pinpoint one? Yeah.
I hope I'm not being rude by saying this, but I've written about this quite a lot. So I would say, if you search for my name and search for my Quillette article, which describes a retrospective that I did a couple of years ago that has some explanation, but very briefly, I was socially awkward. I was one of the younger children in my class, and I was socially delayed beyond that. And for my childhood, I was the kid that was always bullied and did not have a very good relationship with boys or men at all. And that was a very important input to my difficulty in having relationships with boys or men, and seeing myself as being able to mature into one. And that is probably the biggest input, but is it okay if I leave it that short?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. Yeah, I know for myself, I was definitely a gender non-conforming child. There's or girl, whatever. There's no question about that, but I didn't feel any distress because there was no pushback at all in my family. I was very much encouraged to be a tomboy. A lot of the clothing that I wore as a young child were hand-me-downs from my male cousins. So I got to wear a lot of really cool OP shorts and Hang 10 t-shirts. So I was really happy about that, growing up in Redondo Beach as a kid in Los Angeles. And so, I went out into the world. I came out as lesbian when I was a freshman in high school. I had a girlfriend in high school. I was going to gay bars with a fake ID when I was in high school. Like, I was living the dream. And there was no issue whatsoever from internally or from my family. I did grow up in a Mexican Catholic family, and there was no shame or guilt around this kind of issue. And a lot of people would assume that, but there was not. It turns out I have several members of my extended family that I guess all drank from the gay Kool-Aid, because there's like this one line of the family that has like a bunch of gay kids in it. And I knew that, and I had a gay uncle. And so that was not a big deal. And my mother produced drag shows in San Diego. So I grew up around a lot of drag queens and female impersonators and gay men. And so, all of it seemed really kind of normal, so to speak. I was raised by my dad, but when I went to go visit my mom, I would see them. But somewhere around my, I'd say early 30s, I started to feel distressed over sort of the compounding effect of dealing with homophobia, right? Of dealing with my interpretation, I now recognize as my interpretation of the looks I saw in other people's eyes when they saw me, right? My interpretation of their looks were disgust, contempt, fear, anger. I wasn't a social worker yet, and I hadn't been through any sort of specialized training to recognize that I was dealing with cognitive dissonance and cognitive bias. Like, I was dealing with some of my own lack of ability to handle, to tolerate that distress. And I watched a documentary about lesbians who became trans men. And I read a book or looked at a picture book called Body Alchemy that showed pictures of lesbians who became trans men. And I thought, well, I wonder if it would be better to live as a man than a masculine woman. And I went and listened to a doctor talk for 2 hours about testosterone and what it would do. And I was surprised because I had really believed that testosterone would make me violent and angry and aggressive because that's how all men are. I was part of lesbian separatist community. And so all men are terrible, violent pigs. And so I thought testosterone would turn me into a violent person, but I learned from the doctor that it actually doesn't do that. That it's more hormonal imbalances that can lead to violent outbursts. And so I made a phone call. I got on testosterone. I went to go see this doctor and I said, listen, I just want to be able to walk down the street holding hands with my wife. We're still married almost 20 years now. And I want to be able to go to the bathroom without getting hassled. And I think that living as a man is going to bring me much more internal peace. And it has. I've never felt I was born in the wrong body. I never felt that I thought or felt or experienced life as a man. I don't really know what that means. I am a transsexual man. My biological sex is female. I've been hormonally and surgically, transitioned. And so I live in the world as a man now. My legal sex is male. And that, it turns out, is not as an uncommon story as people think. It's actually not that uncommon, but people won't talk about it because if they go to the therapist and say what I said to a therapist, therapist might not write them a letter. So, Stella, you didn't transition, but you mentioned dealing with gender dysphoria as a young person. So just briefly, if you want to talk about that, and then I think Carrie's going to come back on, Dr. Mendoza is going to come back on, and she's going to ask us some of the questions that have popped up in the Q&A and also in the chat box. We have until 7:30, or we have several more minutes, but I wanted to, for the whole webinar, but I wanted to give you a chance to talk about your experience since you didn't transition but still had gender
Thank
dysphoria.
you. Your story, I found your story fascinating. It does make me think of, I've heard many people talk about so many butch lesbians have transitioned that it's actually become a dearth of lesbians for this very reason, that they've all kind of fled. And it brings out a lot of emotions in me of, oh my God, is there really only one way to be a woman? It's a little bit of a frightening story for me just to hear it. I've never heard you speak about this before. But no, myself, me and you would have got on well, Zander, as kids. I was a little boy and I was allowed to do my own thing and I was very free and easy and there was no pressure on me, very similar to yourself. Yes, though there was one big difference. I was distressed. I was very distressed that I wasn't a boy. I wanted to be a boy and it didn't seem right that I wasn't a boy because I was better as a boy and it was blindingly obvious to everybody that I was better as a boy and I should have been a boy. And I actually think it would have been a great boy, but I wasn't a boy. And so that definitely caused me distress. And I came up against like the brick wall of reality. I was not what I should be, was the kind of resounding feeling. It didn't make any sense to me. But why I have such issues around puberty blockers is because although puberty was very, very difficult for me and it was harrowing and a horrible experience, the long-term impact of puberty for me, and I understand it wasn't for the other people on this panel, was to free me from gender dysphoria insofar as I realized that my body was bigger than me, that nature was bigger than me, that I could rage and rail like King Lear on the heath, but it didn't matter because nature actually had more power over me than I would ever realize. And so that was my learning, and it was a bitter learning, but I think it was actually a very for me a very good learning of realizing you come up against limitations in life and you either learn to live with them or you don't, but that's what they are. And I came around, I didn't delight in it, but I came around to being a girl and kind of as in I've no other option, this is what I'm stuck with. And ultimately, it became a much more pleasant experience. And I'm thrilled I'm a mother. I'm thrilled I've had children. I love that role. And I've really grown into becoming a woman. So it's been a very, very different experience for me than it has for you three. So it's extraordinary. Just one thing before we go on to the questions. You did say that if there's anything kind of resounding that you want to say, what I would like to say to fair listeners who are listening is, to me, the biggest issue that is kind of halting progress in this, leaving aside the silence of a debate, is the shallow reading most people have of what's going on. I think it's a very complex issue, and I think most people presume it's pretty simple and it's kind of like being gay. And they haven't really gone beyond a very, very quick thought process. And actually, it's a complex issue. And if you think it's simple, you're probably missing a lot. And there has been a massive, shocking dereliction of duty in the quality of the studies. And so if people are brandishing studies at you, read the study. Don't presume that what is being said is actually being said, because the studies are really low quality and frighteningly not saying what they purport to say. So.
Yes, well, thank you very much. And everybody, you're also going to get a chance at the very end to provide any sort of last words. So if there's something you'd like to add again, also Stella. And I just want to, thank everybody for engaging in this discussion. I've seen some comments that people are really enjoying it. So I want to say thank you to everybody. And I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Mendoza, who's going to share with us some of the questions that have come up in the chat box and in the Q&A. And thank you for that, Carrie.
Oh yeah, thank you, Zander, and everybody. It's a great discussion, and we really appreciate it for Fair Medicine, you participating and sharing your experiences and your work. We're gonna move on to some of these great questions that sort of carry on some of the topics of conversation. One thing is we hear this this sort of gender affirming model. And I think it's as a person in healthcare practicing, it to me has become this gender affirming system. And to that end, one of the questions here is the gender clinic at large, a gender clinic at a large reputable children's hospital, which is really happening across the country. It held an outreach event in partnership with a local school district. It was a Zoom event that had all the typical gender ideology talking points. My question is, how does a non-clinician concerned parent interject into this? Is there an effective message? If I go to a school board, is it a few voices against the established quote unquote medical experts? I can go to the clinic to register my concerns, but I assume that's just annoying noise to them. Do you have any recommendations? So I think again, this issue of these, this gender affirming system that is developed, and how do we all sort of voice our concerns about it? So I'd love to hear whoever would you'd like to go first, and we can just kind of go around the horn. Stella, probably you might have some interesting thoughts on that, even though you're in Ireland. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I do, but I think Corinna's dying to go, so I want to hear Corinna.
That's right. Sorry, Corinna.
Yeah.
You said you were dying to go. Yeah.
Particularly on this question. So this was submitted anonymously, but thank you for asking it. There is something that you see a lot more in the media, which contrasts that with the questions that we're getting here. So many of the questions are children with gender dysphoria. But what you'll see in the media more is trans kids. And I think that, first of all, I really want to make the distinction between these two things. If you talk about language like kids that have gender dysphoria, you're talking about children who are experiencing a form of distress. They probably have some level of gender nonconformity, and they are having some issues with their relationships in their lives because of that, and they're trying to get some care to manage the dysphoria. If you're talking about trans kids, you have already given them an indelible label. They are always going to be trans as soon as you call them trans kids, and the sort of treatment options that you start pursuing for a trans kid is going to look very different from a child who's exhibiting gender dysphoria. So when I see this question, and I saw it, the gender clinic at the large reputable children's hospital had an outreach event with the school district. If their mentality is that there are trans kids that they can pull into the system, then that is going to be a very, very, very different outcome than if you have parents who have children who are trying to manage their gender dysphoria and need to seek a psychologist or a therapist first for a diagnosis and review, and then going to see a clinician for anything that might potentially come as a follow-up to that. So I share your concern, whoever submitted this. I feel like there are probably some very deep ethical questions about a gender clinic, I would say targeting a minority population by partnering with a school district to talk about it. I think that there needs to be a lot more circumspection about advertising transition services to children and who can you talk to. What I would say is that if you have not already joined FAIR, it's groups like this which are going to build the networks for parents to talk to each other and come up with the rebuttals or solutions to these types of scenarios.
Well said, Corinna. I kind of think I have to say that, like what Carrie was saying about the affirmative system is something that really needs a bit of thought. You know, carrying on from what Corinna was just saying, that if you're going to label a child a trans kid, and if you're there and immediately go to put them into the affirmative system, you have to be aware that the affirmative system just pretty much is a shallow one-size-fits-all presumption that this child needs to medicalize as soon as this child shows any interest in medicalizing, and medicalization is the main agenda. And there are no other issues, no other kind of ways to approach gender dysphoria, when there's actually many ways to be gender dysphoric, and there's many ways to treat it, as you would say about any sort of human distress, because we are complex individuals. So I feel the affirmative model, it's a necessary but sufficient kind of approach, but insufficient insofar as of course I affirm anybody who comes in front of me, any client, I affirm the depth of their emotion. I affirm of what they're saying. And I certainly kind of join with them when they're speaking so that I can completely understand where they're coming from. But it would not be respectful to presume that's where we end the therapeutic process, because there are so many other things that therapy offers, which is an exploration of your unconscious motivations, an exploration of your patterns of behavior and your patterns of thought. There's so much that therapy can offer you. It's a rich experience. And for me to just become some sort of nodding dog and just go, yeah, is not an appropriate response to any sort of distress. And I think the affirmative care model is actually, it's a shallow model. I think it should be called confirmation, because it confirms people's suspicion that they should transition, as opposed to affirm. It's a really, really shallow, kind of shabby way to approach the complex human distress that is involved in gender dysphoria.
Yeah, well said, Stella. I mean, it really highlights it. You know, medical care is complicated, and providing excellent medical care is nuanced. And so I think, you know, we're all here because we are concerned about this system that is projecting a one-size-fits-all approach, and not, you know, there's a difference between validating someone's concerns versus confirming them up front without any exploration, like you said. Erin, do you have anything to add to that? Because I know you see people obviously in medical setting.
Yeah. A couple of things came to mind as I was listening to Corinna and Stella speak. I mean, I agree with what Corinna said, you know, that in terms of the language of not calling children trans. I mean, we've got 3 people on this panel that had a childhood gender dysphoria experience. None of us were trans kids, right? And 3 of us have transitioned. None of us were trans kids. And I don't think, as much as I definitely had a very early childhood experience of gender dysphoria from age 3 onward that was distressing, I don't think I would have benefited from a clinician coming to me saying, well, you're a trans kid. I think what I would have benefited from was someone explaining to me that what I was experiencing is something that a lot of gay and lesbian people experience as a part of our sexual orientation. And help me to process that in a healthy way. And maybe as an adult, I still would have made the decision to transition, but at least I would have had a framework that grounded me in reality about it and to work with me, because there's lots of layers. There's gender dysphoria, but there's lots of reasons why. There's a lot of influencing factors that go into a decision to transition. So my having gender dysphoria was only one of those factors. Another factor was similar to Zander's experience of homophobia, and a lot of homophobia in my community and family. So all of those factors are a part of the decision-making process. And the young people that I was seeing had so many different complexities and comorbidities. They were whole people in a whole family and community system. And I really wanted to understand them in the context of their whole system and work with them at that level, not just rubber stamping people onto hormones and then letting them figure all of that out. Even for those of us that do choose to transition, what does that mean? Like we're granted a kind of legal fiction in order to live as the opposite sex, but there's very little guidance in terms of, well, what does that mean? So now you're appearing the opposite sex, but does that mean that you truly have changed sex? Does that mean you have full access to all spaces that the opposite sex has? There's so many ethical dilemmas that we face on a day-to-day basis, and there's really no grounding support for navigating the complexity of that.
Yeah, well, thank you, Aaron, for sharing that. Again, it really highlights that, medical decisions and treatments are really, really serious, and taking an approach of really understanding the pros and cons is super important at the time as well as lifelong. Because as you said, I think people want to know that the decision they made at the time about something was the best decision they could have made. And I think that part of what we're all struggling with is that we see that the full information and the careful approach is not being applied here. Can
I say something really quickly about that, Carrie?
Of course.
When people ask me, as a social worker, if I'm gender affirming, what I say to people is, I don't work as a psychotherapist and I don't work with teens or children, but when I have worked with individuals who have come to me and said, I'm trans or I want to transition, I affirm their feelings. I affirm their concerns. I affirm their process in which they go through to explore who they are and what their options are. And my fear is that this idea of gender affirmation has been whittled down to confirmation or to acquiescence versus taking it in that more holistic way, in the clinical sense of affirming our clients, affirming our patients, who they are as people, not dehumanizing them, but also offering them an opportunity to let's talk more about that. What are your resources? Who are your support system people? Let's talk about your life in this much more holistic way. So I think that is gender affirming, right? But it's not what people mean typically when they ask that.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. One important point, and I'm glad one of our audience members asked this, who's also Fair in Medicine fellow, is just the issue, the response that you'll hear that, hey, if we don't do these treatments, this person's going to kill themselves. So I call it, emotional blackmail. I've had experience in the ER where, it's like, if you don't give me X, if you don't give me this narcotic, during the opioid crisis, I'm going to kill myself. So this emotional blackmail around saying that these things must be done, I think is a lot of people are saying, well, is that true? What's really the data around, suicidality in this population, you know, our understanding is it really isn't well founded. And then this whole issue of using that as a way to funnel people, as Corinna said, into this system. So could you all speak towards, you know, this issue of saying that saying that kids with gender dysphoria will kill themselves if we don't do this? Who would like to take that one first? Stella?
Well, I would. Yeah, I'd be delighted to. I think that 40%, people often quote this, it's a terrible, terrible statistic. And when you're talking about suicide, because it's such a frightening subject, you've got to get it right. You've got to give it the respect to be accurate. And there's this mythical, ridiculous number, which is 40% of people with gender issues attempt suicide. Or they just throw around this 40% number that's just so wrong, it would make your head spin and fall on the ground with distress. What we do know, and the research isn't great on it, but what we do know is there was a great piece of research done in Sweden where they catalogued all the different deaths. It's a very distressing one, but it's a very informative study. They catalogued all the different conditions people had, and these were all suicide deaths. So it might be autism or psychosis or schizophrenia or gender dysphoria. And they were all different, and they made an actual kind of bar chart of it. And they realized that, yes, we know what the very kind of highly suicidal conditions are. They are things like substance abuse and personality disorders and psychosis and things. And, you know, gender dysphoria was definitely, you know, it's an issue, but it's there alongside autism, alongside anxiety, alongside other issues that also are, because when you have a mental health issue, you are more at risk for suicide, but it's not a heightened, it's not an exceptional, very unusual, stop everything and give them all drugs that you can sort of statistic. And it's great. That stat from Sweden is brilliant because it's from the health authorities in Sweden. So it gives a lot of wealth to it. And also there's a kind of an unsaid stat around suicide and transition, which is that, you know, that there's a long-term study also from Sweden where it showed that after 10 years of medical transition, there's a dip in kind of satisfaction. I think the medical complications certainly cause distress. I'm not sure, I haven't transitioned, but certainly that compared to the general population, as opposed to people with other mental health issues, compared to the general population post-medical transition, you're 19.2 times more likely to die by suicide. And so those two stats make you think, okay, this is just a vulnerable population. They need a lot of care, they need a lot of support, but they don't need anybody to start shouting that we need to trans these kids as fast as we can because they'll die by suicide. None of that is true. And it's a real disservice to anybody with gender dysphoria. There's huge, strict, proper guidelines laid down to talk about suicide. We should follow them. And they've been discarded for the last few years, since the conversation of gender has become heightened. Those guidelines have been discarded, and we do that at our peril because there's a lot of myths growing around that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I agree that the normal pathway when someone's suicidal has been just pushed to the side in this area. So thank you for reviewing that. Corinna, what did you want to say?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Stella, the numbers are really important, but I want to add also that there's this cultural element that maybe not everybody on the panel is even aware of. And I hear this from a number of detransitioners, but I know that it's prevalent within the community also, is that young people who hear this number that they're very likely to commit suicide if they don't care, internalize that number and come to believe that if they don't transition right away, that they will commit suicide. And this is an idea that is really perpetuated inside of the trans community, that your suicide is a likely future event unless you can get on medicalization as soon as possible. And you will hear people in the different communities talk about well, I had to tell my doctor that I was feeling suicidal so that they would give me the medicine faster. I wanted to throw out how important that cultural aspect of it is with that number, and it is definitely a higher rate, but it is not 41% attempted commit suicide. That number's
Rubbish.
fallacious.
Yeah. I would like to echo what you said there, Corinna, because I've noticed that within the community as well, that activists, sometimes even activist clinicians, encourage their patients to say I'm suicidal in order to get faster access into the system. That's been happening for a long time now. And the thing too is that a lot of these stats that we have are based on a lot of online surveys. And there are a number of very sort of activist motivated individuals in the community filling out those surveys who are going to answer those questions based on how they want to direct the system, not necessarily honest, reflection on where they're at. And the online surveys too, I mean, there's no limit to how many times you can answer those. So as long as you have a separate email address, you could create 100 email addresses and answer those surveys over and over, and people do, in order to skew the numbers and again, to direct the surveys in the direction that how they want to see the system move in. So I always read those kinds of numbers with a grain of salt and really look at the methodology and how are they asking those questions and obtaining that information.
Thank you. Those are all really, really important real world pieces of information and experiences. So thank you. I mean, that leads into in a series of questions or kind of touching on the same issue is this, activism, which is in the title of our webinar, but the activism, like in schools, for example, where, and I've seen this in my own kids' high school, activists will show up at the school board meetings, saying, if you don't do this, the school's transphobic, and then parents don't know how to speak out, about issues. People are struggling how to talk about this. They feel the activism is just branding or silencing any type of discussion. So certainly that's a theme across a lot of issues that we are tackling in FAIR. But in relation to this, I would love to hear from everybody just advice you have for parents in how to approach their concerns at school and or with a therapist if they take their child to a therapist. How do they express their concerns? So I think we want to take it back to Stella.
Yeah, sure. We at GenSpect, we go into schools all over the US, and we have been quite gratified and pleased to see and surprised to see that the schools that we have done staff training about gender, about these issues, how to manage gender issues in school, it's often called, they have received it very well. And so, yeah, there often is, I've found, and certainly the staff have told us that one or two activist parents often are leading the way in changing policies for a school. Then the school have a policy, and very often there might be one or two teachers who are very into it, and everybody else is kind of nodding along, feeling like this is all a bit unusual and a little bit emphatic, but okay. And when we give training, because we are very much middle ground and rational, we found that it has made a difference. So if at all possible, I think try and get your schools to listen to other views, because there are more and more organizations who are providing more rational, informed, middle road, moderate kind of approaches. Just because the loud people are very loud doesn't mean that there aren't other views. And it does take a little bit of nerve to approach your school and to kind of carve your space. But I think it's worth it. I think you could be surprised. Yes, of course, there'll be some loud people who are against you, but you could be surprised by how populated the middle ground is.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, your website, all of your websites have great resources, but I'm sure people can go to your website, Stella, to find out maybe how they can get
Oh, they
Jensen
can.
into their school.
Easily.
So yeah, Corinna, what do you have to say about, this issue with the activists and
Yeah.
going into schools and how to push back?
It is outside of my arena, but let me say one thing is that if you're a parent, your kids and the other kids at the school need adults to stand up and model the sort of behavior that you want those kids to have, which is to ask critical questions, to not be afraid of criticism themselves for asking questions, and for holding people in authority accountable. So I would say model that behavior for these young people because it's protecting them when you do that.
Yeah, that is true. Aaron.
I hope that one of the things that people are taking away from this talk is going back to the idea that there isn't a consensus. There isn't a consensus within the LGBT. There isn't a consensus within the world of medicine or mental health. Though everyone seems to have the impression that there is, and that's the effect of the activism, right? It's been a very effective lobby in a lot of ways to give that impression that we're all on the same page and behind this, and we're not. But I think when you feel like you're the lone voice and everyone else is on the same page, that can feel very frightening to be the one to speak up. So I would just encourage people to trust that there's a rule in marketing: if there's one, there's many. If you're having these doubts and concerns, chances are there are a lot of others around you, a lot of other parents who share your concerns. And it does take a leap of faith to start being the one to speak. But there are a lot of resources now. I hope that our organizations will help guide that. There are studies and ways of presenting that information. If anyone does want to speak out, I would just encourage you to contact one of our organizations and let us help you, sort of piece those ideas together.
Well, thank you so much. And then Zander, you of course work with us at FAIR with largely made up of parents. And so, I'm curious to hear now, a year into FAIR, what advice you have.
Well, I recommend, just as Corinna did, that people get involved with FAIR if you're really interested in not having to champion this on your own, right? We have tens of thousands of members in hundreds of chapters all across the United States. Go to our website, fairforall.org, look under the chapters tab, find your local chapter, reach out to the chapter leader. Those chapters are meeting regularly. They're made up largely of parents, some school teachers. Our Fair in Education has resources for school teachers and school administrators. So there are whole networks of people all around the country that are working on this issue every day, very much committed to it, putting in hours and hours of work. I will say, just to tag on to what Aaron was saying, and a comment that I saw actually or a question in the Q&A was talking about how, this idea of consensus comes from, for example, when you have a prominent transgender medical provider saying to the news that everybody agrees about gender affirmation and there's consensus here. I think what they're referring to is the fact that maybe the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, that these organizations have put out statements. They've put out guidelines. But that doesn't mean that there's consensus among all of their members, nor does that mean that there's consensus among all of the practitioners or providers within that discipline, because as we know, most providers and practitioners are not members of their professional associations. So we don't even know what number of providers and practitioners they're even speaking for. It could just be the small group that wrote the guidelines, right? Or wrote the statement. And so we need to be able to differentiate between this organization put out a statement, but we don't really know what all the providers and practitioners within that field of discipline, right? That discipline or field, what they actually believe. But I can tell you that, I'm a member of WPATH, member in good standing. So at least for now. And and I do gender education through their Global Education Institute. And I can tell you that, made up of a global network of providers of all sorts, legal, medical, behavioral health, there's no consensus. There is no consensus. It's really difficult to come out with something called a standards of care that's applicable worldwide. That's why it takes so long. It takes years and years and years to do that. And a lot of that has to do with, because you have to grapple with cultural differences, and it's not that easy. So I would caution people in believing that there is the consensus, and that, again, that we're a monolith, because we don't all agree. Not even us on the panel are in full 100% agreement with each other on everything, which I love.
Oh, thanks, Zander. I mean, that's so true again with healthcare. It's a individual situation, and the idea that these associations are representing all clinicians just isn't true. I mean, as a reminder, the AMA wholeheartedly endorsed, widespread use of opioids way at the beginning. So I think we all know, when we're seeing something that just doesn't seem right, and that's why we're here, and we're closing in towards the end. So I just wanted to say thank you again to everybody for participating, to Zander, to putting this fabulous panel together that really highlights the fact that there is, a majority of people who really have a lot of concerns in terms of healthcare for our kids, and for the trans community, and for kids dealing with gender dysphoria. So we wanted to give everyone a few minutes just to say a few, closing things that may not have been mentioned. I know there are a lot of great questions in the chat and the Q&A section. So we will, Gavin's keeping track of that. We will reach out to people for responses, and want to make a plug for everyone to look at the websites of all our panelists for great resources. So with that, I'll throw it over to Aaron to just say a few closing comments, and then Corinna, and then Stella, and then Zander.
You're mute.
I just wanted to start by thanking you for inviting me to be on the panel. It's been a great conversation. I've appreciated hearing what the other panelists have to say. As far as closing remarks, I mean, we've covered a lot of ground and yet barely scratched the surface. There's so much more that could be said. So I guess I would just like to invite anyone, if they did want to have a conversation or learn more, to feel free to reach out to me. And I have Zoom conversations and go out for coffee with people all the time that reach out and just want more information. So I invite anyone who would like to continue the conversation to feel free to reach out and be in touch.
Thank you. Corinna.
You're on mute.
You're on mute too.
I just wanted to imitate somebody who I admire very much, Aaron. Thank you. So
Very good.
I also want to echo what Aaron said. Thank you very much for FAIR to hosting this. There are a couple of ideas. Thank you everybody who submitted questions, and also for listening. I want you to come away with this with a couple of things on your mind. First of all, this field of medicine should be driven by evidence. It should be driven by what generates good results for people in the long-term outcomes. That's not happening right now. And what you're going to hear, what you've already been hearing for the last couple of years, and what you're going to hear a lot in the future, is a lot of emotional appeals. You're going to hear people who are just going to declare that this has to be done for reasons. And it is always okay, and it is always appropriate to say, well, what is the evidence that this works? Because there is going to be a wide variety of evidence. And some of it is going to say, well, maybe in the short term, there's some evidence that this is helpful for this population. What does that mean in the long run? There might be some evidence that says in the long run, this is terrible. We should never be doing this. I would say the most compassionate thing that we can do to help ensure that the trans population has good health care is to make sure that it is backed by data. Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic. Yeah. Stella.
You know, I think I'm more swayed in a different direction than Corinna, even though that was really interesting. I kind of think that we need to kind of loosen up around gender. We need to kind of allow, I suppose, boys wear dresses, and you know, this idea of confining the situation so that we're going to go into this polarized gender, that you transition if you don't conform to the ABC that is being set out as a diktat, is just so regressive. It feels Victorian. And I feel that it's really important that we move beyond, so that maybe one day we'll be in the 2030s and we'll have grown up about gender, and we'll have expanded our consciousness around how we present as women, as lesbians, as gay men, as heterosexual men. And I feel we're really missing something by medicalizing a gender identity, when all we need to do is expand our understanding of a gender identity. But also, I do want to say to everybody, thank you for having us on. It's been really stimulating, and it's lovely to see kind of a bit of cross-border mixing here, going from fair over to gender. And I hope we see many more. It feels like almost a new dawn of maybe we could start expanding our conversations. And I think that's really exciting.
Thanks, Stella. I appreciate all your hard work. Zander.
Yes, thank you so much. And I want to say thank you also to all the panelists. Thank you for agreeing to be on the panel. I'm very, very thankful. What I want to leave people with is this, that, you know, the trend for putting children on puberty blockers originated in Europe, right? I don't remember exactly. They called it the Dutch Protocol, so I'm not exactly sure. I'm bad with, is that Holland or is that Norway?
Yeah, it's Holland. It's Holland.
Okay, sorry about that, Holland. But you know, to the Dutch people, I apologize. Typical American. What I want to say is that, you know, they were the first to do it. They're not doing it anymore. And what I want you to also know is that Dr. Laura Edwards Leeper, a psychologist, was one of the founding members of the first children's gender clinic in the United States. She has major concerns now around this protocol of putting young children on puberty blockers. There's also Dr. Susan Jane Bradley from Canada, a psychiatrist who was part of the staff in the first gender clinic for children in Canada. A lot of concerns now. She's come out recently with an article, Understanding Vulnerability in Girls and Young Women with High Functioning Autism Spectrum Disorder, where she's expressing, she's acknowledging that a lot of the young girls that they were treating probably had autism, were on the autism spectrum, you know, and have, a lot of them have desisted even after starting some medical transitions. So just be aware that there are people who were true champions of this. They were champions of saving these children, of trying to minimize the harm and the damage done to these children by helping them being able to escape, you know, any sort of puberty that was going to take them in the wrong direction. And now they're all doing a 180. And so I think we should take that into consideration when we're thinking about this subject, especially around youth, because they're the ones who were there in the very beginning. They're the ones who championed it, and they're the ones who are now raising the alarm about it.
Wow, thank you. Well, I think we're gonna have to have a sequel. Maybe we'll have to do this again in the fall for an update. But again, thank you everyone, and we're going to say goodbye now. So take care, and this recording will be up on FAIR's YouTube channel, hopefully in about a week. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.